Hope everybody's enjoying their lunch. The Capri always does a good job for us here. Before we get into some of the reason you're here today, which is obviously Andy, I'm just going to give a few announcements from UDI's perspective. So for those of you who don't know, my name is Luke Turi. I'm the current chair of UDI Okanagan. We haven't had an event in just about 2 years. I'm pretty sure, I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure Andy was our last in-person event at that time. So 2 years felt like, I don't know, 6 months or 9 years, depending on who you're asking. But I'm very grateful, as I'm sure, as I see the happy faces around here, I'm very grateful that we can finally do this in person again. And yeah, right? Toby is particularly excited. Thank you, Toby. So UDI, as I'm sure everyone is aware, is doing a lot of things in the development community over the past couple of years, even though we haven't been meeting in person. So a number of those things, as I'm sure you've seen, we've continued to try and add value to our membership through webinar programs, bringing in speakers. We will continue to do a bit of a hybrid approach, as we feel that was adding a lot of value for certain members, depending on the topic or time of day or the event that's being planned. And we're actually doing our first I believe it's our first hybrid sort of luncheon, where we have an in-person event, and all of you that are here as VIPs get a beautiful lunch and get to see everyone's smiling faces. But we do have a number of people that are joining us online as well. And so that'll add a different component for those of you and your team members that might want to or aren't able to make it in person. So that's great. In terms of the policy front, wow, we've been very busy over the past couple of years. There's been a lot of things happening throughout the various municipalities in the Okanagan. We've been working with recently the City of Kelowna on their official community plan update. That was congratulations to city staff. That's been passed by council, I believe, 6 weeks ago, something along those lines. We've also been very active in working with City of Kelowna again with their forthcoming zoning bylaw update. Lots of work there and lots of stuff to go through. City of Kelowna's DCC update, Transportation Master Plan, the DCC update, and the OCP growth scenario process with the City of West Kelowna. A number of different fronts. The best place to get some of that information is through our newsletters or on our websites, but I can assure you we've been very active without some of these in-person events. And then keep posted on future events coming up this year, because we feel like we're very optimistic that we'll be able to continue to do these now into the rest of the year and beyond, so that's great. And because we've got an in-person event, we also have a wonderful executive sponsor, which is Ferris, and Ferris has graciously sponsored Andy's lunches for a number of years now, probably 3 or 4 years. And Ferris is recognized for the caliber of its lawyers and unflagging commitment to client service. The firm has been in existence for over 115 years and has over 100 professionals located in Kelowna, Vancouver, and Victoria. Ferris Kelowna is comprised of 14 lawyers and 25 staff and officers, and offers a full range of legal services, including corporate commercial law, litigation, labor and employment law, family law, wealth planning, and immigration law. A core practice of the Kelowna office has always been real estate and land development. The Kelowna partners have been involved in many of the most significant commercial, residential, and resort developments in Kelowna and the Okanagan region. The firm handles all aspects of development work, from land acquisition, rezoning, marketing, financing, and sales. Ferris Kelowna's partners have been involved with UDI Okanagan from its inception and remain committed to supporting its vitality and lasting contributions to progressive development in the Okanagan region. And attending from Ferris today, seated at our speakers table, is Aaron Dow. And we also have from Ferris, Chris Weeb and Mark Johnson. So thank you very much to Ferris. Our luncheons are also a good opportunity to welcome new members into the fold of UDI. Since our last meeting, but recently, we've added a new member, and that is Talk Shop Media. I'm not sure if we have a representative from Talk Shop here today. If we don't, that's fine. Talk Shop does public relations work in the Lower Mainland and is now a member of UDI Okanagan, so that's great. And I am now pleased to get on to the reason why you're all here. So I'm going to introduce our speaker and our event today, the Rennie Outlook, What Lies Ahead for the Development Industry, presented by Andrew, or Andy Ramlo. Andy Ramlo. So Andy, as Vice President of Advisory Services with Rennie Group, leads Rennie Group's consulting team in providing analytical and strategic support to all aspects of the company. For more than 2 decades, Andy, has provided strategic management advice to leading real estate developers, investors, retailers, and consumers, as well as to many of Canada's most rapidly changing municipalities, crown corporations, and public agencies. The reason why we have a full event here is because Andy does a great job. I'm not trying to set you up for failure, but we're very much looking forward to what you have to say to us today. And we probably will have some time at the end here for a little bit of Q&A, so keep that in mind as the presentation goes. Without further ado, Andy.
Thanks, man. Thank you so much, Luke, and everybody for coming out. Yes, this event was my last in-person event 2 years ago, just before the lockdown. I believe it was like a January presentation, and in retrospect, I made a joke when I was up here that I had just flown in and I had a little bit of a cough, because at that point, we were just starting to hear some of these the COVID cases. You know, it's one of those things. In retrospect, oh crap, right? So anyways, I do have to admit I feel a little bit odd being up here today, given what's going on in the world right now. Independent sovereign country being invaded. I'm at a bit of a loss for words over this, so I think what I would probably just say is that our hearts and thoughts go out to the 40 million Ukrainians right now, which are under a state of war, and to the 1.4 million Ukrainian Canadians who may have relatives, friends, and family over there as well. So we'll continue to watch that as all unfolds as well. So, but all of that said, I am really super happy to be back in person. This is my first in-person talk for 2022, and in bantering with the AV guys and all of you, I'm still trying to get in touch with some of the new social norms, COVID social norms. It's like hug, no hug. Handshake, no handshake. Forearm bump, no. Mask on, mask off. No, what do you do? It's like kind of Karate Kid, right? Does anybody? You guys are a young crowd, actually. You might not remember that. Danya-san, wax on, wax off. I see some of my older colleagues nodding their heads, so at least they get it as well, but nonetheless. So let's get rid of the housekeeping issues to start with. As always, I will provide a PDF copy of the presentation to UDI, and they can certainly send that out so you don't feel the need to scribble stuff down as the numbers roll by you guys. You also have on your tables the most recent copy of the Rennie Landscape. No, I'm not starting a landscaping business. This is our sort of broad take on economic, demographics, and social factors that influence the housing markets. For all of you that are joining us digitally today, you can jump over to rennie.com. On the left-hand side, there's an intelligence page that you can go to. You can download a digital version there. While you're on the page, you'll get this pesky little pop-up. Our digital team is really good. You can plunk your email address in there and get on our subscription list for the range of stuff, including the next version of the landscape, which we're just starting to talk about right now, as well as any of the other data feeds that we send out. So jump over for anybody who's in person, hit rennie.com, and you can certainly get a copy of all of our data feeds as well. Okay, changes are only constant. A quick note about my role change at Rennie. Luke nailed it. Yes, I'm now VP of Advisory Services. Some of you already know I've moved back to sort of my traditional consulting roots when I ran Urban Futures, and along with my colleague Jen Podmore-Russell, we're spearheading a new service line at Rennie. It's Rennie Advisory Services. And to be honest with you guys, I am a bit remiss to let go of the VP of Intelligence title, just because it was such a cool handle but nonetheless, I'll digress on that front. We're currently working with a broad range of our traditional developer clients, not on the sort of sales and marketing side, but early on in terms of early planning phases for stuff. Working with a handful of municipalities as well as some sort of non-traditional clients like Van City Credit Union. Fortis BC is a client right now. So do get in touch if you want more info about what Podmore and I are up to with the new service line for Rennie. Okay, so what a wild ride the last 24 months has been, right? There's literally been so many things that have happened, even in the last year, that I had a really tough time figuring out what the hell to say to you guys today. Just over the past 2 weeks, we had the first group of the 2021 census data out. It's like a kid in a candy shop. New immigration plan was announced last week, and we had the BC budget drop. So there's like just an absolute ton of information. Inside story, usually when I finish this talk, for you guys or for UGI down in Vancouver, I have a little bit of postpartum, and I always have this challenge about like, oh crap, what am I going to talk to those guys about next year, right? You don't want to hear the same stuff, and I definitely did not have that problem this year. I almost popped a gasket last week when the census data came out, and like, oh, do I just focus on all of the neat new census data for these guys? And then we had the new immigration targets, and like, yeah, it was just a really crazy week. But anyways, I'm not going to talk about the census. I'm going to digress really quickly for a minute here and just stick the headlines up. You guys were one of the fastest growing metropolitan regions in Canada. You guys also had one of the fastest growing downtowns here as well. And just a quick note to say that, yes, I've stood up here for about the last 5 years telling you guys about our outlook for the region and why it may be a bit more robust than some of the other outlooks out there. And I'm just going to say, like, it kind of appears that kind of our outlooks are coming to fruition, right? You know, I'm just saying. That said, I wasn't surprised by the headlines that said you guys were one of the fastest growing regions. But that being said, some of the recent migration numbers, some of the recent immigration numbers, as well as some of your recent MLS data did provide me some points of ponder, actually. They do make some of our initial assumptions from last year look a bit conservative. So I'll get more onto that later on. Just a quick shout out to Ryan and the planning crew at the City of Kelowna for pulling the downtown numbers together. 4,000 to 5,000 units that were planned out to 2040 are already under construction. Like, whew, good for you guys. My colleagues at the City of Vancouver have exactly the opposite problem, right? Yeah, I know somebody knows, there's somebody from the City of Vancouver over there. But anyways, just a quick note that I didn't do any of the work on the OCP with Ryan and the city for 2040, which, you know, given the current data, may be underestimating the future population a little bit. You know, I'm just saying again, get a hold of me. But anyways, I'll digress. On to today's talk. It's, yeah. Okay, so a roadmap for today. The last 2 years really have been, for me, a time of introspection. I'm the kind of person that I'm a media, a news junkie. I try to compartmentalize, quantify, qualify all of kind of the barrage and continuous flow of information that is always on all of our news feeds now. And to the point where I told my wife that I was going to try and make a relational database out of all of the information that was coming down, and she gave me that look, this one, you know, and said, you probably don't want to do that. And I knew exactly what she was talking about, so I didn't do that. For me, the constant flow of information is a bit calming, actually. It's a bit settling, but I know for many others, the continual barrage of information and news headlines can be a source of stress. StatsCan reported last fall that 1 in 4 Canadians over the age of 18 screened positive for symptoms of depression, anxiety, PTSD. These are clinical screenings. This isn't self-assessed, and that was up from 20% 1 year earlier. So certainly some challenges on that front as well. My mom always told me that it was good to talk about things, so I thought that I'd start off today on a bit of a personal note with some of my thoughts on equity, equality, and diversity before I move into the more traditional statistics in terms of your market up here and our outlook for, our new outlook for the region. And I'm going to call that like a quasi-new outlook for the region because we did just have these new immigration targets come out. So, but nonetheless, okay, here we go. So, one other quick digression. I hate it doing this. So what I'm going to cover in the next little bit is really outside of my wheelhouse. The reason why I married my wife was because she's a very sympathetic and very empathetic person. I'm not. I'm the one that has motorcycles and old cars, and I have Walmart stocks and stuff like that. So talking about things like equity, equality, and diversity for me are very challenging, just in terms of thinking about them, let alone sharing them with an audience of 140 here and another 80 online. So I ask a favor of you, bear with me as I go through some of the next slides that I'm going to go on. So, okay, thoughts on equity and diversity. And I didn't actually want to change that slide yet, so I'm just going to go back and stick handle here to that. Okay, so thoughts on equity and diversity. One of the more challenging things for me over the last 24 months, and in looking back on it, it's kind of humorous as well, was that I had to get bifocals. Yeah, it sounds kind of weird, but yeah, my optician calls them progressive lenses, and I see thumbs up. I call bullshit on the progressive lenses side of things. They're totally regressive at best, but nonetheless. Mentally, this entailed me coming to terms with, on the demography side of things, what I always talk about is that just about everybody gets older every year, yes, and before I know it, I'm not going to tell you when, but oh my God, I'm going to welcome in half a century. Crazy pants, yes. But nonetheless, a whole bunch of physical things came along with my bifocals as well. Like I broke a toe, which I've injured twice mountain biking. Toes are like ribs. They suck when you break them. I fell down the stairs at our house, no word of a lie, twice. And I'm still trying to figure out when I need to look out of the top of my glasses versus the bottom of my glasses to get things into focus, okay? So nonetheless, I had to continually remind myself over the last 2 years in dealing with my bifocals of those eternal words of wisdom that are etched into the passenger side mirror of your car. Objects in mirror may be closer than they appear, right? Yes. So this experience is, I can joke about it, it's only been mildly traumatic, but ironically, my bifocals became a bit of a metaphor for me over the last 24 months as I really tried to wrap my head around this sort of notion of world events and things that were going on around me. And to be honest with you guys, some of those things, they really knocked me on my ass. Like, honestly, a few of the events of the last 24 months, specifically seen through my new lenses, really shook my sense of what I thought I knew, what I thought I saw, and what I thought where I was going. And for us all here today and those joining online, it really is a shift in perspective that I would like everybody to think about as I move, not just through the next 20 slides, which are the real tough ones, but the 50 that follow that, which are kind of the data slides. So nonetheless, there's my setup for it. So what's come into greater focus for me during the pandemic? Well, I'm going to go back to May 28th, 2020. This was when George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis, Minnesota by a white police officer. George was allegedly trying to use a counterfeit $20 bill in a convenience store. And as with many other things, social media saw the gut-wrenching video of Mr. Floyd's murder circulate around the world instantly. After that, worldwide protests ensued against police brutality, racism, injustice in the US. And in the weeks following Mr. Floyd's death and murder, 2,000 cities in the US reported mass protests. 200 cities imposed curfews, and more than 30 states had more than 62,000 National Guard troops mobilized to try and quell the unrest. Those were Donald Trump's words. As a point of context, this would be like mobilizing the whole adult population of the city of Vancouver to mobilize or to quell the unrest. So my initial reaction to watching all of this unfold through all of my media channels ranged from, man, I can't believe that this is happening here in Canada, to, oh, I feel so fortunate, or sorry, I can't believe this is happening, but to, I feel so fortunate that we're here in Canada and that we don't have to deal with this level of racism, violence, and injustice. So I see a couple of people nodding their heads with that statement, and you know what? I know also that there's going to be some people that are shaking their heads at that, and really it's my ignorance that I want to highlight here. And as I reflected back on it, and these initial reactions were kind of like looking through the top of my bifocals at these issues of equity, injustice, and racism as well. So the issue of systemic racism came more into focus for me a couple months later on September 28th. On that day, a woman in a hospital in northern Montreal died. But moments before Joyce Equine died, she recorded a video of herself laying in her hospital bed as healthcare staff berated her with racial slurs. Joyce wasn't black. She was a 39-year-old Indigenous mother of 7. And rather than in the States, now calls were going out across Canada to recognize the pervasiveness of racism here within Canada as well. When Premier François Legault was asked about the existence of any form of systemic racism in Quebec, he denied it whatsoever. The coroner's report, however, said that prejudice contributed to her death, and the coroner's report went so far as to say that Joyce likely would still be alive if she were a white woman. Yeah, think about that for a second. Then, last June, there was a family that was run down by a pickup truck in London, Ontario, when they were out for an evening walk. The Asphalt family wasn't black, and they weren't Indigenous. They were a Muslim family. This targeted attack by a 20-year-old white Canadian wiped out 3 generations of a family. The 9-year-old was left without his grandmother, his mother, his father, his mother, and his sister. Calls again went out across Canada to recognize racism, Islamophobia, and I have to be honest with you guys, this one hit me particularly hard. Now, you see, my wife's Egyptian, and we have 2 young Muslim Canadian kids. And so perhaps through some really weird genetic quirk, neither of our kids actually look like my wife or myself. Our little guy came out with a flaming head of red hair, and his skin is about as pale as the screen over there. And after my daughter was born, she'd come down to our office in Chinatown in Vancouver, and she'd get winks from all the old Asian ladies, and they'd say, good mix. My daughter looks decidedly Asian for some weird, wacky reason, but all of that said, all of our extended family here, both in Canada as well as in Egypt, look like the Asphalt family. So this was a very, very difficult one for us to address as a family, particularly with my 9-year-old daughter. So back to my glasses. So I had gone from early on looking through the top of my bifocals at these issues, and I now felt like I was kind of moving down into the middle of my bifocals looking at or addressing these issues of equity, equality, and justice. But all of that said, then in May, we had the confirmation of 215 Indigenous kids buried at the Kamloops Indian residential schools, and similar confirmations, residential schools all the way across Canada. So over the last 100 years, we operated about 130 residential schools in all corners of Canada. And the objective was to systematically remove Indigenous kids from their families in an attempt to assimilate them into white European culture. Over this period, we separated about 150,000, it's estimated, Indigenous kids from their families, communities, and their root cultures. Again, for some context for everybody, this would be like taking every kid under the age of 25 today, resident in the city of Vancouver, and shipping them off. Incredibly, incredibly traumatic. The residential school survivors have always known that these grave sites have existed, but the confirmations shocked just about all Canadians. And admittedly, I was one of those incredibly, incredibly astounded Canadians. The news from Kamloops and other residential schools, it sort of rocked my world. It brought my education about who we literally were as Canadians into question. What I do is I look at numbers, so to bring the memory of these kids into some contemporary context. 1953 was estimated to be the height of the residential school system in Canada, and in that year there were about 11,000 kids, Indigenous kids, in residential schools, okay? In Canada today, there's in the order of about 15,000 Indigenous kids in foster care. Indigenous kids represent about 8% of the Canadian population. They represent more than 50% of the population in foster care today. This is the legacy of what's called the 60 Scoop. It was a supplement for the residential school system as well, when kids were scooped out of Indigenous families and put into Canada's foster care system. But these current numbers show that we are still doing this. It's just called the Millennium Scoop today. Suffice it to say, issues of social justice, equity, racism, equality really came into focus for me as a result of these confirmations. And I was being really made aware of what systemic really actually meant and how pervasive some of these issues can be here in Canada as well. So now I did feel like I was looking through the bottom of my bifocals at this. But there was one more thing that happened which was really, really tough for me to wrap my head around. to make things more complex, I also had the realization that all of these kind of mental meanderings of mine and this refocusing in my analogy of my stupid bifocals was, like, in and of itself a privilege for me to be able to consider these things. And this was really tough for me to really wrap my head around. And with that said, I did feel a little bit of comfort in these words from Maya Angelou. We do the best we can with what we know, and when we know better, we do better. So a little bit of solace there as well, but nonetheless. Obviously, these issues are all way more complex than I can do justice to here in the front third of my UDI talk. And there's people out there that are much, much smarter than I that can talk much more extensively about our history of racism, injustice, and inequality in Canada. And it's also not to say that these particular 5 issues were the most prominent issues of the last 2 years. They're just the ones that were at the top of my mind. We also felt the implications of climate emergency, heat dome, 600 deaths due to heat exhaustion, a fire that wiped out the whole town of Lytton, floods that quite literally wiped away or washed away the town of Merritt and flooded a good portion of the Fraser Valley. We've also had more than 2,800 deaths as a result of COVID, and most importantly, more than 2,200 deaths in our deadliest year of the opioid crisis as well. So we've also recently had the Emergencies Act in Canada enabled and pulled back, and we're currently sitting watching in real time the invasion of Ukraine. So nonetheless, I don't have any answers to solving, resolving, or addressing any of these issues, but perhaps as maybe a bit of words of wisdom from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, one of the first steps towards reconciliation is developing a greater understanding, and maybe with me starting out this way, we can all have a little bit of greater understanding on that front as well. Okay, so another issue that I've been really trying to get a deeper understanding on is housing equity. So I'm not talking about the amount of money that I have locked up in my house or the amount of equity the market has just given me over the last 12 and 24 months, but I'm talking about housing equity and equality. Housing prices have been on the rise for a while, but once we got over our initial shock of COVID, we've seen housing prices increase in ways and also in places that are, like, quite literally without historical precedent. I've had calls from St. John's to Sudbury asking me what the hell the drivers to price increases are. But I don't want to get into the debate about how disconnected prices have become from local incomes, as David does here. But I've said for years, comparing things like average or median sales prices to average or median incomes is just a fundamentally stupid thing to do. There's a lot more actors on the market right now that are contributing to prices and price increases. And the large one that we talk about, or that we've been tracking for years, is the bank of mom and dad, and the influx of some of those billions of mortgage-free housing equity dollars flowing into the market being a very, very significant impact. On that, Benjamin Tall from CIBC was on the news a couple of months ago. They dug down into their mortgage portfolio, and he noted that an average of about 30% of first-time home buyers in Canada were receiving help from the bank of mom and dad. And in Vancouver, that was to the tune of about $180,000. Benjamin's a bit of a colleague. I emailed him, asked him for the Kelowna data. He said, no, don't have it, sorry, so don't have it. But what Benjamin also found was that it wasn't just the first-time buyers who were receiving help. Move-up buyers, so people who are already in the market, were also receiving help from the bank of mom and dad, about 10% of them. So again, relatively significant. But kind of the mind-blowing one for me was that the dollar value of those move-up markets, or those move-up owners who were moving up the market in Vancouver, on average, they were getting $340,000 a piece from mom and dad to help finance their move-up purchase within the market. So again, you look at what the absolute leverage is on that within the market and what that means, very, very significant impact. So back to the issues of equity and equality with respect to housing. If you're part of the 40%, the 30 plus the 10, like, good for you guys, but that still means that there's 60% of folks out there who aren't receiving help from mom and dad. And in Benjamin Tall's words, the only way to provide a solution to affordability now is to inject supply into our housing system. We can't do it without adding supply. So I can pull a whole bunch of different stats that illustrate how inequity is growing within our housing market. But as an example of what's concerning me, Here's the distribution of detached sales by price for the Okanagan in 2016. So that's simply ranking the lowest price sale on the bottom of that chart at about 135 grand, all the way up to the 6.2 million sale that was at the top side, 3,466 sales in 2016. The median, or the midpoint of that, was about $565,000, okay? Bob and I started looking at sales like this probably more than a decade ago. And we came to it about asking ourselves, like, should the $6.2 million sale really form part of conversations about housing affordability and availability? Meh, probably not. So what we started to do was to lop off the top 20% of that and look at the bottom 80% of sales within that as being the units that would commonly transact for your quote-unquote average person and have an impact on availability and affordability. So here's the same chart for the 3,588 sales that happened in 2021. A couple of things come into focus for me here. First, the median detached prices in the region increased by 60%. Holy camolies, a 60% increase in median prices. Second, that the value of the top sale almost doubled since 2016 from 6.2 to $11 million. Maturing of your market up here as well. But perhaps more importantly, it's how the bottom 80% of that market has changed as well. And let me tell you how I'm looking at this as well. So if we break that data into quintiles, which just is a fancy mathematical way of saying 5 equal buckets represented by those lines, and look at the change in value within each of those buckets, I see a rather challenging pattern for me emerging. And by the way, as a bit of a digression, this is exactly the same pattern that's emerging in Lower Mainland, Victoria, as well as I was in Kamloops in the fall. You think you guys are alone? Very, very similar issues that are going on. But nonetheless, if we look at this on this quintile basis, there is the price break points for each of those quintile buckets in both 2016 and in 2021. And if we take the midpoint of the bottom quintile, it was up 67%. If we look at the second quintile there, it was up 66%. So who's getting squeezed within this market? It is that younger side of things, people who are trying to get into, the market. That was detached. If I look at attached, exactly the same pattern emerges on that side of things as well. Overall, the median was up by 66%, but if I look at that bottom quintile, more than doubled, 114% increase in the midpoint price of that bottom quintile. The second quintile, 81% up. So again, it's the bottom end or the lower end of the market that is getting squeezed in this, and it does really bring issues of housing equity into a greater focus for me as well, specifically in the family-oriented product types. I looked at the same charts for you guys on the condo side because you didn't have a big stock of condos transacting earlier on. The pattern doesn't necessarily fit, but it will be that segment of the market that does tend to backfill some of this as well. But let's not forget about the folks who are out there renting. CMHC just this week, it wasn't supposed to be out until next week, so it wasn't on my radar. Here's another reason why I popped a gasket a couple of days ago. They released their data early, their rental market survey. It showed that vacancy rates in Kelowna were well down. There's what it looked like. Height of the pandemic, you were a 2.6% vacancy rate, which in a housing context is still relatively low. The housing experts would say anywhere from a 3 to 4% vacancy rate is just the bare minimum level you need to transact back and forth with or move within the rental market. Here's where you guys sat, down to 2.1% last year, and then the most recent 2021 data, 0.6%. So what does constrained supply do? A lot of us took Economics 101. It pushes up prices. So over the past year, in terms of overall rents, we're up here in Kelowna, in the Kelowna metro region, by about 6%. But again, if we look at the family side of things, the 3-bedroom units, they were up by 16% in terms of average rents. So very, very challenging, not just on the ownership side of things, issues of equity and equality on the rental side of things as well. So, but I do have to say that housing supply isn't something that's come into greater focus for me. I've stood up here and across Canada for many, many years saying that we need to inject more housing supply into our housing markets to deal with issues of availability and affordability. But nonetheless, this is something that I was happy to see last fall when the BC provincial government, is actually 2 years ago now, when they commissioned this report, the Opening Doors report. It was a joint commission between the Government of Canada and the province of British Columbia to look at issues of housing supply and affordability. Probably one of the most important or interesting ones here was that they identified that this is not just an issue, housing availability and affordability, an issue of the most vulnerable, but it is now also middle income earners and families, which are very, very challenged on that front as well. Further to that, another colleague at Scotiabank, Jean-François Perrault, recently put this report out. He benchmarked Canada in terms of our stock of housing relative to our population against our G7 countries. And what he found was that we had the lowest per capita ratio of housing of all G7. He calculated that we have what he called a structural deficit with regard to housing of up to 2 million units. That's relative to our other G7 counterparts. I did this for Canada in a little bit of a different approach. I took a demographic approach to it. I come up with about 350,000 units in terms of a shortfall. But nonetheless, much like everybody else, he cites the root of growing inequality in our housing markets as being a lack of supply relative to available or insufficient demand. So given the census releases about your region up here having one of the fastest growing populations, how are you guys doing in terms of housing availability? I'm going to get to that. First, I'm going to jump into your current residential market stats, because I think there's a whole bunch of really super important supply and demand dynamics going on within the resale market here as well that I'd like to touch on before I get to our new outlook on that front. Okay. Total sales in the central Okanagan. Year over year, they were up about 30%. As you all know, I like longer term historical averages. So if I look at the last 10-year average, those 7,461 sales compared to an average of just over 5,000. So you're almost 50% above where you would be on an average market or a typical market in terms of sales throughout the whole of 2021. How about inventory on the flip side of that? Well, inventory was only up by 5%. So again, back to this notion of the supply and demand curves. If your demand curve is moving way up and your supply curve is not moving along with it, what happens? Well, there's an increase in prices. Relative to your long-term historical average on the inventory side of things, only up about 4%. So very, very similar as well. Very constrained on the housing inventory side of things in terms of the number of available units that are out there within the market. So again, from a pricing side of things, you don't need to have a PhD in economics to say, well, we should have seen increasing prices. And yes, we did. I presented this last year. We were at pre-pandemic about 567,000. In the middle of the pandemic last year, it had increased by about 17% to 662. And then the most recent data is about 780,000. That's up about another 18% in terms of where your average prices are. I'm going to shift databases on you guys a little bit. These are the same average prices, but from Korea. A little bit of a different geography, so the numbers are just a little bit different. 795,000 is where the most recent monthly data from Korea are with respect to average prices. The reason why I'm doing this is I can get into the monthly data, I can get a little bit of a longer historical database to make the supply-demand point as well. There's what total active listings look like over that same period, going all the way back. Here's where I have a challenge with my bifocals. Back to 1990, yes. I don't even know where my glasses are. That's the other thing about having glasses. Like I put them down, I don't even know where the hell they go. But nonetheless, a couple of interesting things emerge on this front as well. If I look at this notion of supply and demand, what you can see is when we had relatively stable or increasing inventory, prices were relatively stable within the region. Notably, in that late 1990s, early 2000s period, in and around 2010, 11, 12, relatively stable. But we can flip that around and look at periods where we had relatively low or declining inventory, and this is where we saw the big run-up in prices. That magic level, just given my chart, seems to be around 4,000 units on average in terms of active listings. And then we come into the pandemic. There's where we sat before the pandemic, and we can see that with regard to the CREA data, average prices since the beginning of the pandemic are up about 52%. So very, very significant increase, almost about 800,000 in terms of average sale prices. But what I really, really want to draw your attention to is this little number down in the corner. There you go, that one, 1,186. That was the number of active listings within your market at the end of the month. So at the end of January, on average, if I go back for the last 10 years, you guys should have had almost 4,000 units of active inventory with anybody who is moving within this market or moving to this market could choose from, right? You guys fell well below that in terms of the average level. If I look at a March average, which is typically when the spring real estate market comes to life, on average, you guys have about 4,600, let's round it off a little bit, units that would be constituted as part of available supply or active listings within your market. So that means that with respect to the number of active listings, now you got to see about a 4 times increase in the number of active listings moving into your spring market to get back to an average market. So in terms of that delta, that means that like it's about 3,500 units in terms of additions. I also looked at what the delta was to go from a typical January to a February. How many new listings do you guys think you added in that traditional period? 400. And then from February to March, coming into the spring market, 500. So my outlook for your spring market in terms of getting up that addition of 5,000 new units coming to market, you guys are going to have a super, super tight, challenging spring market. Which, if you're an existing person who is selling real estate, that's great. If you're somebody trying to get into the market, incredibly, incredibly challenging. I'm going to say that issues of availability and affordability within this region are only going to get worse. But as I said earlier on, this is exactly the same picture that I see in Victoria, Vancouver, Kamloops, Nanaimo, of all these little places as well. So again, back to some of the big challenges with regard to availability and affordability within our markets. Key insight, this was a funny one. January 2020, I said, when it comes to prices, supply matter. When inventories are high, prices are stable. When inventories are constrained, prices increase. It still applies. Economics 101 certainly works. And then January 2021, I said, of course, this is all relative to demand, which we've been seeing increase significantly, DC, during COVID. And these two conclusions from my last 2 years are certainly reflected as well. I'd only say that the demand side of things has been amped up even more so as well. I'll get into a little bit on that on my outlook side of things in terms of the next slides. So there you go. There's the state, I would say, of your current residential market. Some great opportunities if you're an existing owner. Some very, very significant challenges if you're somebody trying to work within or get into that market as well. Okay, our outlook. I did mention that there was recent changes to some federal immigration targets. This goes back to 2017 when the federal government came in and said we wanted to raise immigration targets from about 250,000 up to 310, 340, and they were expecting to hit 350,000 in 2021. COVID came along. We didn't hit the 340,000 that we were supposed to. We actually hit about 184,000. So last fall they came around and they put this new immigration levels plan out, which said that we were going to go to 411,000, 421,000 in this current period right now. So this is what we had based our models on. We work with the federal government numbers in terms of working from the national level down through all of the provinces and then down to our metro regions, Lower Mainland, Victoria, and Kelowna for you guys here. But under the radar, on Valentine's Day of all times, the federal government came out and revised those immigration targets. For this year, from their 411,000 that we were supposed to have this year, they've actually increased it to 431,000 immigrants. They went a little bit further and a little bit farther as well. Next year, 2023, 447,000. 451,000 in 2024. These numbers are like huge in terms of scale. That 450,000 puts us at an immigration rate of about 1.4% of the Canadian population, highest in all of the G7 countries as well. Why are they doing this? Some of this is to make up for the shortfall that we saw, the 184 that we had during COVID, the 2 years of well below target immigration. Some of that right now, even though we've had well below target immigration, we're moving back towards historic lows with regard to unemployment rates across the country. So it is in large part to backfill some of the labor component that we need to see our economy certainly grow as well. I have not included or incorporated these new targets into our forecast in terms of population. But here's what it looks like. There's what I was working with, or what I am working with right now at the beginning of the week, 421,000. But there's what the targets look like, up to 451. So a very significant increase in terms of our immigration targets, which will have implications for the province of British Columbia, as well as for Kelowna here as well. What are those implications? There's an infographic of what immigration on average look like to Canada. There's BC's share. We pick up on average about 15% of Canada's immigration. It's about 40,000 people. If I do the back of the envelope math at that 452, 15% gives us about 67,000 immigrants, 68,000. The irony here also is that 2020, 2021, it's kind of like Canada decided to head to the coasts. They went to the Maritimes, but predominantly they came out west. Right now, we're getting about 17, 18% of the immigrant flow in Canada as well. 2020-21 data were about 28,000. The number is, yes, below what some of the peaks were, but remember the total was way down as well. So we are getting a much larger share of immigrants that we typically would in other years. So again, a bit of a double kick at it with regard to those increasing immigration targets. But we've also seen a whole bunch of smart Ontario kids like myself say, you know what, I'm heading west. It's happening. If I look at the BC interprovincial migration numbers, that 2020-2021 number, 34,000 interprovincial migrants. Usually I'd quote that number and somebody would say, yeah, okay, Ramlo, that's the inflow, but what's the outflow to other provinces? This time around, that is the net number. And it's just about double to what we are usually accustomed to. So again, a very, very large inflow, and this is definitely reflected in the numbers for you guys in the Okanagan up here. Here's what the components look like for you guys. The gray line, dark gray line on top is what I want you guys to keep an eye on. Last year, well, 2 years ago in terms of the migration data, 2,185 net interprovincial migrants. Here's what you guys did last year, 3,535. So very, very significant increase on this front in terms of the interprovincial migrants into this region as well. Well above where I was expecting. We expected an increase, but definitely not to that degree. There's our forecast going out, certainly coming down in the longer term. We looked at the historical pattern of economic change for the region and the taper off, and that's what we modeled that on. But what I will draw your attention to is the 1,300 net immigrants, the red line on that as well. That line is only going to go up as I go in and I update my models to incorporate the new immigration targets as well. So in some senses, I could say that my outlook for the region here is a bit conservative. Here's what it looks like in absolute numbers, 229,000 up to about 312,000. That is about 10,000 more than what I had forecast in my previous forecasts for you guys as well. With that said, let's just look at the regional growth strategy here as well. Now, the regional growth strategy was put in about 2013. I dug down into it to just see what they were at. I did not work on it, full disclosure. I looked at it, it was BC Stats numbers that were used. About 270,000 people in 2036 is what their forecasts were for. I tend to work on a temporal basis, so that's like about 6 years in terms of growth that they are underestimating this particular region. So that was done in 2013. I went, given that it was BC Stats, I grabbed the BC Stats forecast for the region as a point of comparison. 289,000 is what BC Stats' current forecast for your region is here. Again, there's a couple of different ways to look at that difference. That's about only an 8% difference on stock. If I look at it on a flow basis, that's almost a 30% difference in terms of the flow. So again, kind of like me poking fun at the guys at the City of Kelowna for their 2040 forecast, maybe being a bit conservative. I'm going to say that the regional growth strategy as well may be underestimating where we're going on that side of things as well. All right, so what does it mean? I flip back to this one just to say that, again, back to this notion of potentially being conservative depending on where we end up on that immigration front. How do you house 83,000 new residents? As I've said before, we take a demographic approach to this. We look at household formation rates. These are from the census, so that we capture not just the size of the population, but changes in its demographic composition and people entering family formation and household formation. If I take that demographic profile and apply it into your population each year going out to 2041, I come up with about 40,000 net new housing units are going to be required to house population growth and change. Again, maybe a bit conservative on that front. So again, pretty significant growth. The 2021 census counted about 14,000 occupied dwellings in West Kelowna. So again, I always like comparisons at a point, as a point of comparison. That means you guys are going to have to add within this region about 2.8 West Kelownas within the next 2 decades. So pretty significant on that front as well. So how are you guys doing on the supply side of things? This is where I really like to dig down into it. The gray bars there are just the net additions on the demand side coming out of that same approach of looking at the life cycle of housing. It's housing occupancy demand. We run them through the census. The red line is housing starts. Now, a couple of interesting things. That's gross starts, so we got to net that down for demolitions as well. But look at what happened to starts over the last little bit. Interestingly, when I was up here last, not up here, when I was digitally speaking to you guys last, the building permit data showed a really, really low level of building permits that were in the pipeline. And ironically, and I moved the slide out because I didn't have time to talk about it, but nonetheless, it was in March, building permits just went way through the roof up here. And that's what's in part contributing to this very significant increase in the number of starts. So good in terms of trying to deal with some of the issues of potential demand, but there's where the net demand should be on this front in terms of additional units, about 2,800 relative to about the 3,200 starts. Recognizing, again, starts are just starts, they're not keys indoors. So what I do is I take that pattern of starts and I forecast it forward to get net occupancy demand or net available units once I've netted down for demolitions. And here's where I end up. I end up at about 2,700 over the short term in terms of available units coming to market. But there's what my additional occupancy demand looks like. At least in the short term, it surpasses it. So again, back to this notion of supply and demand, I see a relatively constrained market, not just within resale, but within new product or this a little bit of a broader outlook with regard to just purely roofs over heads on that front as well. But I am going to jump back to Jean-François' work in terms of calculating a structural deficit. We've been underbuilding the market for years now as well. The degree to which we all do recognize that there is some form of structural deficit within the market, you guys locally here as well, that previous chart is underestimating what the potential demand is as well and would move up and suck up a bunch more of those available units in terms of going forward. So nonetheless, to the degree that we would incorporate this notion of structural shortfall, again, I would be conservative with respect to the number of additional units that we would be forecasting on that front. So my key insight sort of to finish off is that the Okanagan is certainly going to continue to move through a period of constrained supply in the face of growing demand. That's both with regard to new, resale, but then also let's not forget about the rental guys as well. This is going to lead to growing pressure on housing availability within the region. That's going to in turn continue to put upward pressure on housing prices and going to widen what I've been calling a generational divide that's being created within our local and also national housing markets as well. So honestly, guys, I do see some very, very challenging times with regard to housing availability, housing supply, and affordability as well. And I guess I have to thank you guys for listening to me ramble through some of that. I'm going to finish off with a couple of challenges for you guys. There's 5 very, very well thought out recommendations from this report, which is called Opening Doors. If nobody's seen it, this is a joint report that was commissioned by the province of British Columbia and the federal government to look at housing supply and affordability within the province of British Columbia. So the first challenge is for you as community builders and thought leaders, because you're all out here to hear some joker talk about Kelowna in 20 and 40 years. In your own sectors, it doesn't really matter if you're a planner, you're an engineer, you're a developer, you're a politician, an architect, or just part of the general public. Your first challenge is to find something. My first challenge for you is to find just one thing within one of these 5 recommendations that you can champion or promote within your communities or your groups to help foster a greater amount of housing supply to come within our local communities. And I'd also throw on top of that, if you haven't already, I'd maybe challenge you to have some conversations about social justice, equity, equality with your friends, maybe colleagues, and for those who have kids, maybe most importantly with your kids. And it might be a good idea to sprinkle some thoughts on about environmentalism, maybe our current climate crisis, which has become sort of so evident within the province of British Columbia. So I'll be honest with you guys, it's been very hard for me to share some of these thoughts with you guys today. I'm used to standing up here making fun of myself and, well, some of you guys as well. But as I describe sort of how I see some of these things unfolding, I was compelled, I felt compelled to share some of my concerns about where I do think we're going on housing affordability, availability, equity, equality, and diversity as well. Unless we're able to address some of these housing supply and availability issues, I do think we are driving a demographic wedge between those who are currently in the market and those who are trying to be or need to be. And that does not portend well for all that we deem to be Canadian as well. So, on that heavy note, I'm going to end on a light note. I've got another challenge for everybody. So, my wife bought me this t-shirt for Christmas, okay? It's an alphanumeric code that you guys are going to try and decipher. And for the first person who deciphers it, I have a coveted Rennie travel mug made from 100% recycled material, and it is even dishwasher and microwave safe. Are you guys ready? Your challenge, if you so choose to accept it, you can just blurt out the answer, is to decipher this. Nice, you're close. Come on, Bill Gates. Actually, it's Steve Jobs. It's a Mac. Go. Oh, you know, I hear a whole table of it over here. Boom. Okay, you guys are going to have to figure out how to split that mug. Go to it. So, yes, intelligence is the ability to adapt to change. Now, I've got one other quick challenge because I have a second mug. Can anybody tell me who said it? No, but I'll give you a hint. Ha! Whoever got that one first, you can come up and grab the second mug. So, Stephen Hawking. Yes, thank you, Mr. Hawking. So with that sort of concludes my formal part of this. And in talking with Luke, we've got 5, 7, 10 minutes to field a couple of questions. questions. So I'm just going to throw it back to you guys. I am more than happy to entertain some questions with respect to some of the stuff that I've presented here, with respect to other things. God, inflation is probably one of the biggest topics that we talk about in the office, but also I'll hang out a little bit afterwards if people want.
Andy, we all know that we're facing a supply and demand crisis. You didn't really touch much on supply chain, cost of materials and stuff like that. How does that factor in your crystal ball?
Oh, it's huge. We have some of the developers that we're working with right now they've established whole departments to try and secure supplies. I think it's just a reality in the short term. My hope is that if I listen to the Bank of Canada, as well as stuff coming out of the States as well, that it is by and large supply chain issues that should be sorted out, and that does go into sort of general levels of inflation. But at least in the short term, yes, we need to expect that inflation on the hard goods side of things is certainly going to continue to move upwards, which makes issues of availability, affordability even more challenging. The really important one on that front that I'm watching is not with respect to the prices of inflation and the prices of concrete or lumber, it's the labor side of it. And this is where it can become very, very pervasive in an inflationary context. We had 2 provinces during the pandemic come out and say, we're increasing minimum wages. Let's do it. They've done it. We've also heard from employers in all sectors saying, man, like, in order to get people to come back, the restaurant sector being a really good one, well, we got to change our model. We've got to pay people more. So to the degree to which we start to see some of that labor wage inflation come in, I think we are moving into a period where we will see above average inflation as well. But it's my hope that with respect to some of the supply chain stuff, that we will start to see some of that level off in the next, if you listen to what's coming out of the States, it should be 6 to 18 months. So right behind you, there was the gentleman had his hand up as well.
I was just wondering if you can talk about point number 5.
Point number 5, oh, damn it. So many.
More equitable treatment of renters and owners.
Yes, oh yeah, totally can talk about that one. So what the commission came out, and one of the very first things that hit the media was that they were proposing to get rid of the capital gains. There's no capital gains on your primary residence if you sell. And that was something, this capital gains, they had said we should get rid of that or reconsider it. Finance minister, I'm not joking, within half an hour of that coming out, was in the media saying that we are not contemplating changing any of the capital gains. So the commission knew that that was going to be the case. They had those conversations. We've also heard from the federal government that there's going to be no changes to the federal capital gains with regard to housing. So what they're proposing is that, well, how do we, in light of that, how do we try and balance the tides between the owners and renters? And one of the other proposals is for them to go in and say, well, what about like a rental tax credit? So you may have, if you're a renter, you may have a differential tax rate, or there may be a rebate or a bonus on your federal taxes as well, to try and balance it out on that front. But the reality is that there's not a ton of other levers that they can use in that context to try and level the playing field. But that's essentially what they were talking about. And the big one coming out of the commission was getting rid of capital gains on primary residences, and it's a no-go, it's a non-starter. So there's some other issues that they're trying to work through on the provincial and or the federal government side, and it's this notion of taxation that they're trying to move towards as well. Okay.
Any thoughts or insights into what we might see in terms of supply side levers from Minister Eddy towards the end of the year?
Oh, yes.
Can you restate the question for the live stream?
So supply side measures. Do I have any insights or thoughts on what may come down, given that Minister Eby is out rattling his saber lots and lots and lots in the media? And full disclosure, I do sort of have a little bit of a involvement with the minister's office and sort of feeding them data as well. But to your point, I don't have any insights. It's always a one-way thing. I never get anything back. So But that said, I'm a relatively smart individual. I can read a room. But a couple of things on the supply side of things. Yes, the housing needs assessments that all municipalities have to now, by law, compile. I think that they're going to start to be used as a bit of a lever to say, well, you haven't met your housing needs assessment targets this year, guys. We're going to do something about that. And what they're proposing is a little bit of a stick and a little bit of a carrot approach to it. They may withhold something like infrastructure funding on that front. But for those who are achieving their targets, there may be some funding allocated on that front as well. One of the other really fascinating ones that I floated to them on the supply side was there's not a lot of municipal jurisdiction over land use, right? Land use is the jurisdiction of each individual municipality. So from a provincial side of things, it's very tough to put levers onto any of that stuff. And California is a really good example where they put in a parallel approval process. It was focused on affordable housing. But what the state said was that, well, Mr. and Mrs. Developer, if you're not getting the timelines that you need with the local cities within California, you can come to us and apply for this program, and it's a parallel program that will help you get we will give you your approval. And there was it was a formulaic thing where there would be some money that would go to the city and all of that kind of stuff. So it was well thought out. But what they found happened was that none of the developers would actually go to this alternate process. The cities didn't want the developers to go to the alternate process as well, because the amount of money that they were able to extract out of that alternate process, or that was paid to them through that alternate process, was well below what they were able to extract or to negotiate on the development side of things. So this was something that we've been sort of talking a little bit about in terms of an alternate development process. And that's another one that, not exactly the California model, but for specific components like social, like rental, there may just be this other fast track approach to getting that stuff to market as well. One other one, not on the supply side, but on the demand side. I don't know if this is going to be the case, but there's also been rumblings and conversations, and I'd say between Bob and I at the office, this is also something that we've said, is actually a true speculation tax. Right now, the foreign buyer speculation tax is not a true speculation tax, and this is something that we've kicked around with David Eby's office as well. If somebody buys and transacts within a very short period of time, well, they should be paying some form of tax as well. So that would be something that there may be some kind of announcement in the future on that to round out the demand side measures. But I think it's mostly going to focus back on the housing needs assessments and the housing targets, and a little bit of a carrot and a little bit of stick approach to that as well. Luke's telling me we've got time for one more question. Who's going to step up to the plate? Oh, yes.
Andrew, the government a couple of years ago froze rent increases. And now they have allowed, I think, some kind of inflationary increase, but it's not keeping up with the actual cost of ownership of rental properties. Is there not a lever that they should be using to encourage more building of rentals? Because if your costs are locked in below, or your revenue is locked in below your cost going up, why would we want to develop rental properties?
Totally agree. The answer is yes. Exactly what and how to do it. CMHC is working pretty hard through some of the financing vehicles to help. Outside of the cost of concrete and the timelines for development of it, which is where some of the municipalities on the timeline stuff may have the ability to shorten those and make those costs a little bit easier. It's on the financing side of things that there may be a real lever there. And I haven't heard anything from the minister's office in terms of trying to help secure further low interest loans, but they are working with BC Housing to make the most out of the federal programs that have come around through the National Housing Strategy. But I agree with you, we need to be doing more. And with that said, if you look at the starts data from CMHC for the rental starts, we have started, I don't want to say an astronomical amount. We've started an astronomical amount of rental relative to our history over the last 2 decades. So like it is moving in the right direction, but you're 100% right. If you're not able to, one of the developers said, well, if we're not able to raise rents, why would we do that? It's a no-go. It's a non-starter. We can't afford to do it, and that will provide a big kink in the supply of stuff. So, you know, the caps and the ceilings are a really interesting one and an important one that, as we move out of COVID, the provincial government should look to revising those as well, in addition to providing some incentive on the financing side to help get more stuff to the market. So, as always, there will be a PDF that will go out with our numbers and our outlook. I will hang out a little bit afterwards, but I do sincerely want to say thank you to everybody for coming out. It is so nice to see everybody's, some smiling faces, some frowns and shaking heads, which I love, which means that not everybody agreed with everything that I said, and that's what provides good conversation with everybody. So be safe, take care of yourselves, and hopefully somebody close to you as well. So thanks so much for coming out.
Thanks very much, Andy. At this time, I'd like to bring up a representative of our executive sponsor, Aaron Dow from Ferris, to say a few words.
Thanks, Luke. It's my pleasure to be able to thank Andy for coming up today and providing us with these insights and for taking the time to come up here in person, relearning how to pack a suitcase, I understand, braving the cold, and coming up and just taking the time to synthesize all this for us in the central Okanagan. It's a huge, and we really appreciate it. We've got a small token of our appreciation.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Ferris. And of course, again, from UDI, thank you so much. Lots of great things to think about. And of course, as a organization, one of the things that we focus on a lot in our region, as in other regions, is housing supply. So to have some of the data presented in that way, it's extremely compelling, and we're very grateful to have that. I will say, as Andy said, slides will be shared. But the actual live stream of this event will be available on our website in about a week's time. So for those of your team members that maybe weren't able to view, watch out for that. A couple of housekeeping things I would just like to share, that we have secured June 10th, that's 2022, this June 10th, for our UDI golf tournament. And Toby, you're already on the list. This year, the golf tournament will be at the Okanagan Golf Club, and both courses, so we're very excited to get that going. It's something we weren't able to do last year, and a lot of people were extremely upset about that, and so we'll make sure we have a great event this year. So with that, great to see everybody in person. We look forward to having a future event soon, so please keep an eye on your emails for that, and we'll bring everything to a close. Thanks so much.